Yes.
Dr. Pickles, I'm going to turn now to the ACVSB, the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. And your statement tells us that you had involvement in its establishment. Yes. Do you have any insight into why it was not established earlier than it was?
I don't think so. There's more information that wasn't included in my statement that I've seen more recently in papers, suggesting it followed after a meeting of EGA in the summer beforehand as a result of the Chief Medical Officer giving instructions after that EGA meeting. And then there's a question about why it took so many months before it was set up, and some of that was to do with agreeing the membership and so on, and then there was a change of ministers as well. So other than that process, which I've seen in some documentation, I don't know why it wasn't thought of earlier than that summer.
And then can I just pick up on that last point about membership? One of the documents you might have in mind, it's DHSC 0002429_076. Sorry, Lawrence. So this is a minute from you, 3rd of January 1989, to Dr.
So that
QALYS.
Yeah, that explains that there's a really quite a long time period between 6th of September
and so we can see it refers in the first paragraph, following our meetings with CMO on the 6th of September and 19th of October, discussions at EGA and elsewhere, and consultation with the territorials, that means Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Yep.
Dr. Moore put up a submission to the then PSH on the 6th of December. Although Mrs. Curry had agreed and signed the letters before some of us realised the submission had gone forward, no letters had been sent out. I understand CMO has some reservations. And then the first issue is about the remit and whether it should include transplant. Don't propose to ask you about that. The second then was in relation to membership. And there was a question about who should be the representative of the biological subcommittee of CSM. Who does not have any other axe to grind, as it's put. Now, not on that specific issue, but on membership more broadly, how was the decision taken as to who would be on the committee? What kind of individuals or what kind of specialities needed to be represented on the committee?
Well, I think if you go to the top, from whatever I sent to CMO on the 6th of September, I think... No, it was meetings then. I think I got steer from him, and we then started putting together lists of the specialties we needed representations and potential individuals. And we'll look, because there were so many interests, and looking particularly for those who could bring more than one hat to the table, but not, as suggested here, somebody with a particular axe to grind. So they could be open-minded as to what the issues were. And some were, de facto, sort of ex officio type members, in a way. We had not much choice in terms of the fractionators, for example.
Now, your statement tells us that after the first meeting, you handed over to Dr. Raymond as medical secretary, but you then continued to attend the meetings as observer.
Can I just stop you there for a moment? The transcriber has sent me a note.
Sorry.
No, sent me a note during the lunch interval. There are occasions when you're so keen to answer the question that you get in there a little quickly, and you're also talking when counsel is finishing her question. I hope you don't mind my mentioning.
No, please do.
Let her finish, because the transcriber can't do both at once.
So
I'm sorry to have to mention it, but
apologies. That's from having watched the hearings the last 2 days. I have a fairly good idea what's coming next. That's why.
Well, it may not always be accurate. We'll wait and see.
So you continued to attend meetings as an observer?
Yeah, can I just... I think you suggested, it, apart from the first meeting, I think Dr. Raymond was medical secretary from the first meeting as well.
Yeah, you may be right. So I think I've slightly misread the way in which you put it in paragraph 16.3 of your statement. Now, we saw with Dr. Raymond that there were briefing meetings with the Deputy CMO, the Chair, before the ACVSB meetings. Did you tend to attend those briefing meetings?
I think so, yes.
And then you've told us in your statement that after each ACVSB meeting, there would be internal discussion on handling the outcome, including phrasing and timing of any recommendations to ministers. Was that through a meeting or just the process of minutes and memos and so on?
I think there was probably a debrief, and I certainly found minutes of one or two that I took. So it wouldn't necessarily involve the chair, but it would be actually going through the action points that arose and allocating responsibilities.
And then can I ask you to look, please, at INQY 1000184. So this is an extract from the evidence of Dr. Perry, who was a member of the ACVSB. And if we could turn, please, to the second page, please, Lawrence. There are... Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's the full transcript that's up there. Could we go to page 35, please, Lawrence? Yes, so if we look, first of all, at the top half of the page, right-hand side, you'll see that there's the question and answers quotes from evidence that Dr. Perry gave to the Penrose inquiry. And if we pick it up in the right-hand column at line 8, Dr. Perry told the Penrose inquiry this: "I thought composition of the committee was perhaps, with hindsight, unduly based to the science, the expert virologists, who are very authoritative people. I have to say this, it's not a criticism of them, but standing back and perhaps 20 or 30 years on, the public health perspective was not as dominant in fact as it possibly could have been." And then he was asked whether that remained his view, and he said this: "Yes, I think it does. I would just underline this is not a criticism of the virologists, but it seemed to me that the best became the enemy of the good, as it were, as the expression goes. That they were searching for perfect outcomes rather than good outcomes that could meet a public health need." Now, first of all, do you have any thoughts on the point in terms of membership as to whether there was a sufficient representation from a public health perspective, looking back now?
I mean, it's always nice to think of additional disciplines that should have been there, and obviously now as a public health person, I would say public health, wouldn't I? I'm not sure what the contribution would have been at that time that would have been helpful to the debate. I think either here or somewhere it was being suggested that public health would have particularly been concerned about the impact on the recipients. Can I say that looking around that table, I didn't have any doubt that everybody was concerned and very conscious of the impact on recipients of blood. That was a given, but was well understood. And indeed, one of the greatest advocates of that was, my memory, was Philip Mortimer, who was one of the virologists who's here being criticised. The report, the ASV, the committee, reported up to the Chief Medical Officer, who was a public health specialist, being an experienced epidemiologist. And of course, his view, when seeing comments about HCV screening in particular, was really what was the science, what's the prevalence, what's the predictive value. So reminding that public health people particularly like working with data and would have not appreciated the lack of data there was here. And I'm also conscious that in public health, all the time people are pleading for good ways to spend money to prevent diseases, and screening programs is a case in point. A lot of time people say, well, surely it would make a difference if this had been picked up earlier, if you'd had been able to screen it. And so we would be familiar with the Wilson-Younger criteria for screening, and of which clearly don't apply in blood transfusion screening, but that would have been at the top of the mind of any public health practitioner, and this would fall, HCV screening would fall at first hurdle, basically. There wasn't a reliable test for the disease, we didn't know the natural history, there was no treatment for the disease. And so that comes back to what other sort of public health input could have there been. Well, if somebody with a regional medical officer, for example, was likely to have been one of the types of people who could have come in, he would have, I would have thought, immediately looked at the cost of what was going on and thinking, how could I afford it in my region? And indeed look at for the cost benefit of the proposals. The net outcome of that is I wouldn't necessarily assume that public health would have pushed for greater screening, earlier screening, than not having public health there. And, you know, one of the other aspects of this in terms of the cost benefit is they could very well have asked, particularly they came from a regional medical officer perspective, not just was the health gain in terms of preventing infections in the recipients, but actually what's the health gain that is lost for not being able to spend that money on other patients, where the health gain would have a better value for money, basically, in other areas of health. So that's the sort of perspective that could have been brought, and some of that, and I noticed that there is you have a health economic group that is looking at some of the, looking retrospectively at some of the cost benefit of surrogate testing and HCV screening from a historical point of view. It would be very interesting if they, well, I certainly hope they will be looking at that in relation to cost benefit of other potential interventions at that time for other groups of patients. So you have a view, so you get a balance. So I'm saying public health would brought a wider balance about other patients as well as the recipients of blood.
The second point that Dr. Perry here made was this overall idea of the best became the enemy of the good, the search for perfect outcomes. And having now had the benefit of reading through, I think probably you've been sent most of the minutes, not obviously all of the underlying papers or anything like that, but I think you've had enough material and given a narrative in your statement so that you will have been reminded of the decision-making process. Would you accept that there's some force in the observation that Dr. Perry makes there?
I don't remember him making it at the time, and I'm not sure that is true, really. It's what comes across from me, rereading these minutes again, is how difficult it all was. And it wasn't that the science was improving. We went back at some times. There were discordant results between different centres, that we clearly had a different population from what they had in the United States, but it also looked as if we were different from Germany, different Scotland, different centres, UK. We didn't know about different strains of virus. The tests were really hopelessly unreliable. Science, well, I'm afraid the science was obviously important, but it wasn't on the niceties of the science. It was really quite crude level that the tests were not sufficient. And I do not recollect at any time that the judgment was even finely balanced within the committee to go earlier. I think in principle everyone agreed, yes, this is something we're going to have to do and want to do, but the time is not right because the science is not there. So that was the feeling I had. So I'm afraid I have a, you know, I was trying terribly hard with hindsight to come to a view that's sympathetic to the case of those who have been infected as a result. I'm afraid I can't. When I look at it, I don't see that's appropriate.
Well, I'll come back to some of those themes, Dr. Pickles. If we just look first of all at the bottom half of the page, picking it up now on the left-hand column, line 5. Again, this is a reference to Dr. Perry's evidence to the Penrose inquiry. He was asked about the contribution of the Secretariat to the meetings. Did they contribute to meetings, those individuals? And then this was Dr. Perry's answer to the Penrose inquiry. Yes, there were certainly Dr. Raymond and Dr. Pickles. I'm trying to recall if there were others, and there's a reference to Dr. Purves. Yes, periodically they were called upon specifically to report on a particular issue, but also took a full part in the discussions of the committee. And then the question that's put, that's your recollection of the role of the DH Secretariat, that they weren't simply there to put together the agenda and take a note, they participated actively in the discussions. Answer, no, they had quite senior medical officers from the Department of Health that were part of the committee. They weren't full members of the committee, but then it wasn't a voting committee. It didn't used to vote on issues and so on. there was a process that I never really understood what the detail was, and we would have the discussions at the meeting, and then those discussions would get taken away to the Department of Health for further consideration, and perhaps a revised position might come back from the Department of Health for consideration. So they were very much an integral part of the process as far as I recall. And then his recollection is that was less of a case with the Welsh, Northern Irish and Scottish representatives who tended to be more observers. Is there anything there that you disagree with, Dr. Pickles, from your recollection of those meetings?
Yes, I also obviously heard what Dr. Raymond said as well. So let's take them in turn. Did we speak to and introduce individual reports on topics? Yes, we did, and that's well recorded in the minutes. Did we take a full part in the discussions of the committee? We probably did on those topics that we had introduced, so explaining and adding more detail. Did we take a full part in discussions that were leading to decisions of the committee? No, I don't think we did. And I think Dr. Raymond was quite correct in reminding you, or telling you, that he was a very good chairman. And Dr. Metters, I can't say the same for Dr. Harris, so I have less memory of how he behaved as a chairman, but Dr. Metters was really very careful and proper on making sure he got view round the table, not always recorded in the minutes of what every individual said, but he made sure he was reflecting on the views of the committee, and that was not the Secretariat, that was of the committee. So we took an active part in some of the discussion, not in the recommendations part of it. We then, what's the next point he makes? Voting, I don't remember ever voting. It was not a voting sort of committee, frankly.
And then he talks about the discussions being taken away to the DH for further consideration.
Yeah, so there were clearly some things that we, it was recorded in the minutes. We would go away, we would discuss with colleagues, or we would initiate a evaluation and report back, and so on. And as the Welsh, Northern Irish and the Scottish, I'm not sure the Welsh and the Northern Irish, if they were there, said anything. There may be a separate Scottish view occasionally from, but they were much more classical observers, I think.
We can take that down, thank you, Lawrence. Now, it's clear, I think, from the terms of reference and other materials that the ACVSB's role was to give advice, make recommendations. It had no decision-making power, is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And in principle, the Department of Health, the Minister was free to disagree with the advice, is that right?
Yeah.
It would equally presumably be open in principle, at least to the Department of Health or to the relevant Minister, to do something that the ACVSB hadn't recommended.
Yes, yeah.
Can I then just ask, before we come specifically to the topic of screening, about the issue of confidentiality? Mm-hmm. There appears to be no doubt that the meetings were intended to be required to be confidential. There are various occasions in the minutes when the chair opens the meeting by reminding members of that fact. You were asked about this in your witness statement, and if we could just turn that up. So, Lawrence, it's WYTN 6965001. Yes, page 26.
Yeah.
So paragraph 18.2, you say, the reason for confidentiality was to ensure that there were no misunderstandings or mixed messages about committee decisions, most especially those which were market sensitive or risked being exploited for commercial gain. Now, if we can just put to one side for a moment the question of market sensitivity or commercial considerations, because in principle, would you agree those could be dealt with by confidentiality over certain items rather than the whole of the discussion?
Yeah, in theory, yes.
The objective of ensuring no misunderstandings or mixed messages about committee decisions, how does keeping the process confidential, secret, ensure there's no misunderstanding? Doesn't it rather mean that there's no understanding at all of what the committee's doing?
Now, I'm not sure I can speak with confidence for this committee, but for certainly experience with other committees, people may have had a very forceful viewpoint which was rejected by the majority of the committee. And in their account later, they have skewed the way the discussion went, or less than honest about why they were, in effect, voted down by their colleagues. I think that is, in terms of the misunderstanding or mixed messages, I think that's what it was about, really. And essentially, the decision of the committee was in the minutes. And Dr. Metters was a super chair. I mean, he would, as you saw the minutes, he would summarise the decision for the sake of the Secretariat who are writing it down. But also, if the committee didn't like his summary, they would have had a chance to interject at that time. So basically, the minutes were what the decisions were. I think they were accurate. Would they be confidential these days? I don't know. But I think practice has moved on from that time.
But the minutes themselves were effectively confidential, were they not? They weren't.
Well, is it?
Or were members free to distribute the minutes or publish the minutes? That's not the impression I think we've received from anyone so far.
I think they weren't, and to my mind, they were in confidence rather than confidential, if that makes sense. So they weren't security classified in a civil servant-y way. So they were in confidence. We might have said confidential, we meant in confidence. And I think the expectation was that, yes, they would not be shared around and copied around. Having said that, clearly the Scottish and the Welsh and Northern Ireland representatives were free to copy within their own hierarchies, and we expected they would do so.
Again, really as a matter of generality, would you accept that one potential disadvantage of approach of saying that this must all be strictly confidential is that it prevents a more open discussion of the issues, particularly beyond the narrow confines of the committee? It makes it harder to... It removes the opportunity for other informed individuals to say, well, hang on a second, there's something there that the committee's not thought about, or there's something they might have got wrong.
It does, indeed. But it also protects the committee from ill-informed lobbying from certain interest groups. I mean, the intention was to have a balanced committee so that all these issues could be weighed against each other and a sensible decision reached.
Now, in relation specifically to the issue of screening, you've told us in your statement we don't need to go to it, and so we can take that down for the moment, please, Lawrence. The question of HCV screening was one of the top issues in your time in Med-SEB. What I want to do is look at just a handful of documents with you, Dr. Pickles. I'm not going to go through all the documents and all the minutes, not least because we did that exercise with Dr. Raymond yesterday. I want to look at a handful that involved you or documents we haven't looked at, and then ask you some more general questions, reflective questions about the process. So just to give us a couple of dates without going to the documents, we know that the issue of hepatitis was considered first at the second meeting in May 1989. The reference for that, no need to put it on screen, Lawrence, is NHBT 000519, I think. Oh, no, 5019, sorry. And it was said to be both a priority and something to keep under review. We know then that when we get to November 1989, so this is just again a date to give you a grounding in the chronology, Dr. Pickles, that was the meeting, again just for the transcript, NHBT 305043, at which it seems the committee wanted there to be a confirmatory test, FDA approval and a pilot study. So that brings us towards the end of 1989. Can I then pick up with you a document that you had responsibility for, and that is NHBT 0000189. Oh, sorry, that's wrong. It's 1_001. Sorry, Lawrence. So NHBT 0000189_001. My apologies. So this was a paper compiled for the January 1990 meeting, and I think we understand from other documents this was an initial draft by Dr. Raymond and then reworked by you. And it was you who spoke to it at the meeting on the 17th of January 1990. And I just wondered if you could help us understand this document a little more. So paragraph 1, in spite of the acknowledged difficulties with the Chiron test for hepatitis C, and in particular the lack of confirmatory tests, the committee at previous meetings has cautiously supported the introduction of routine testing in the UK, provided the test itself satisfied the FDA, and pilot studies in the UK show testing to be practicable. The cost would be substantial. Full examination of the cost-benefit would be needed to persuade senior NHS management that such testing was appropriate and worthwhile.
Yes.
Now, as I understand the decision-making practice, the ACVSB would consider the evidence, make a recommendation. The ACVSB itself, I think, was not directly concerned with questions of financial resources.
Yes.
And then it would be for the minister to decide whether to accept that recommendation or not. What was the role of senior NHS management? Why did they need to be persuaded that the testing was appropriate and worthwhile?
Essentially because it was their money, and if they allocated resources to screening, they couldn't spend that money somewhere else. But if they could be persuaded that actually there would be savings in terms of reduction in infection, then that would make it much easier to accept that. I mean, I think at this stage we had the NHS executive within the department, but was clearly guarding its resources, and a lot of financial pressures in the NHS. So this was a statement of fact, and I think people realise we had to make our case and make it as persuasive a case as possible, not just on public health grounds, but actually appropriate use of resources as well.
One can understand.
And that wasn't within the remit of the committee to do the cost-benefit analysis, but we needed their help because, as you see from the rest of the paper, it's pretty pathetic. I mean, we didn't have even the essential building blocks to do a proper cost-benefit analysis, so we needed their help, expert help, to tell us what to put in the various elements to be able to do the analysis, or rather get our economic advisors to do.
But was it envisaged that even if the committee had recommended the introduction of screening and the Secretary of State had agreed, that nonetheless NHS management could nonetheless decline to introduce it?
No. I think the NHS management were under the direction of the Secretary of State. I mean, there may have been an argument between the minister responsible for the policy and the ministers responsible for the NHS resources, resolved by the Secretary of State. So.
And then we can see you saying in the second paragraph, just really as you've said a few moments ago, there are too many unknowns to permit a proper cost-benefit analysis. The annex attempts to list the relevant headings and provides guesses for some of the possible answers. Advice is sought from the committee on any factors, headings which have been omitted or which are incorrect, what figures or values can be attributed to each item, and what other sources of advice or information might enable more accurate estimates to be provided. And then if we go over the page, we can see we have the heading benefit, and then the first benefit is said to be prevention of transfusion-associated symptomatic non-A, non-B infection. And then we can see there are no actual figures there identified.
So we needed help with this.
So that's the dearth of data.
Yeah, exactly.
And then that's under method A. Likewise, I think under method B, there are essentially a series of question marks. And then you look to see what would then be, is this right?
This is the costs of health
Yes.
isn't it, for each of these, yes.
So where you say from annual number of cases prevented, direct costs of healthcare, top of the and then question
So that's
mark per case.
direct cost of healthcare that we wouldn't have to give because those cases have been prevented, yes.
And then top of the next page, what's indirect costs?
Need to know, say, grouping these cases of mortality rate. I don't know whether that's like these are government cost benefit, benefit levels and that sort of thing. I don't know. I can't. I'm not sure now.
It might be, given the age, sex, occupational grouping, it might be the costs to society generally of having someone taken out of action because they're ill.
It could be. Yes, you're right. But it's. I don't think it's my headings. I think this is what the economic advisors asked for. So you're right. So it would probably include.
There's certainly a possibility.
Yeah.
It's an understanding.
And then
But I think what we needed from the committee was to know how we would get information on age, sex, occupational grouping of those cases and view on the mortality rate. So I think that was the data we wanted from them, not how then to do the calculation in terms of the benefits.
And then 3 was intangible costs, e.g. pain, grief, and savings from fewer chronic hepatitis cases to be discounted to take account of several years' delay. And then we've got the question mark, and then QALYS.
QALYS, yeah.
Now that's a term that may be understandable by those involved in, for example, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, but not
Yes, they will definitely know how to.
not necessarily by the general public. So could you just tell us what
I'm sorry, I find it difficult as well. So the quality adjusted life years. So if you have one life year saved, somebody lives for a year longer. But if they live for a year longer, but because they're under a certain amount of disability, then that could be adjusted. So quality adjusted life year. And for each year of life, so if it's with a young person, you can get, a baby can get a very long quality from their life being saved as a neonate. But if you're in your 90s and you have a fantastic intervention, your life expectancy is so short that you can't get the same. And it's a way of comparing apples and pears and benefits for extension in life and improvement in quality of life. It has been highly criticised, particularly by those who have a long-standing disability, because they claim their life is valued less in this process. So it is imperfect, but it is the best we had at the time for making comparisons between utterly different diseases and different populations.
So that first overall heading under benefit, item 1 on the previous page, is this right? It's an attempt to put into financial terms the consequences of people not being infected with hepatitis.
Yes. Yeah.
And then if we look at 2 is prevention of non-transfusion associated symptomatic non-A, non-B infection. So that's the idea that if fewer people are infected through transfusion, then there's a reduced pool of infection in the community. Is that right?
Yeah, but we didn't really know how they would pass it on. So the normal mode of transmission in the community was unclear, which is one of the reasons why we needed advice from the committee, because we didn't know how much.
3 then was reduced risk of subsequent litigation. Could be substantial if other nations institute screening, CF HIV testing, although we would argue such governmental decisions are not judiciable. And then 4 was helping BPL/PFC sell fractionated products overseas if Hep C screening becomes a requirement overseas and surplus product is available. So that's the attempt to quantify benefit, and then there is an attempted quantification of cost.
It's the headings at this stage, that's all.
Yeah. So we've got the direct screening costs, how much the test cost, the staff that would be required, what it might cost to counsel positive donors and so on. Indirect screening costs, replacement of lost donors. Where does the figure of 500k come
I don't know,
that?
but presumably somebody must have told us that's the number of donors that would be lost, and that's a normal cost of recruiting new donors.
So
I'm assuming that would have come from I suppose Roger Moore would have provided it from the MBTS.
So, in terms of what the actual cost would be, is that an attempt to capture the publicity and marketing?
The publicity, I'm assuming now that that's what it was.
Because it's quite difficult to see what other costs there might be.
No, I think it is the publicity and so on, and the additional costs of having a new donor rather than a replacement donor, a repeat donor.
And then we have additional costs, which are said to be unquantifiable. And again, if you can just help us understand those that are not self-evident. Potential litigation from stigmatised donors.
Yes, somebody else had raised that in the documents as well, contemporary documents, is that somebody who's been labelled as positive but couldn't be told if they're positive or not, and the impact that might have on their life insurance and their family relationships and so on, and they might have a case against the transfusion service.
And then I think the others are probably self-evident in terms of what they are: paperwork, equipment, overheads, diversion of skilled staff from other duties. Yes.
One thing that was missed out of here, which was raised by the committee, is the treatment costs for those positive donors, which could be quite, because here it's just down as counselling of them, which is in effect a transfusion service viewpoint. But there's also then potentially the treatment costs as they go to gastroenterologists and so on. For those that are genuinely positive, there could be quite extensive treatment costs. But if there were effective antivirals, then that actually would also be a benefit to those people who have been identified as positive donors. So that was a more complicated bit of the argument, but that came up in the minutes of the meeting when this was discussed.
It might be said that if, as a result of this, you're identifying donors as hepatitis C positive, correctly identifying, so not false positives, and then treating what is a serious condition as best you can, it might seem counterintuitive to put that, as it were, in the argument against the introduction of screening.
Yeah, and I think that is commented on elsewhere in the contemporary paperwork. But at that time, there was no effective treatment. I think it was mentioned this would change if there was effective treatment.
And then just to complete at the top of the next page, training of new staff, consequent delays in availability of blood components, and then there's a note about the not knowing the effective loss of hepatitis C immune donors from the plasma pool. Again, it might be said that this kind of exercise undertaken with the assistance, I think it was of the Economic
Advisor's Office.
Advisor's Office, doesn't really capture in human terms the benefit, the reason, the ultimate reason why you introduce screening, to prevent people being infected with what can be a fatal illness.
I'm afraid it doesn't look like that, does it? But all of these sort of cost-benefit analyses are done in this sort of way. And, behind that QALY item, there's some very, significant real life stuff for a lot of individuals. So I'm sorry, it looks dry, but that's the way it is.
And then if we come to the meeting at which this was presented by you, it's at PRSC 0001477. It's the meeting of the 17th of January 1990, and I think we can just look at the section that concerned this paper. It's page 5. And it's paragraphs 31, I think, to 34. So we see, so it's bottom half of the page, please, Lawrence. We see the minutes record, you spoke to the paper, explained its purpose was to identify the considerations and highlight the number of unknowns involved. And then there's a suggestion you'll get together with Professor Zuckerman to try and work out one of the missing pieces of data, which is numbers of possible preventions. And then there is the point I think you mentioned a few moments ago, Dr. Gumpson saying there's also referrals and treatment of those donors who are found to have hepatitis C. 33 is a reference to pricing of the tests themselves. 34 members invited to send any further observations on the subject to the Secretariat for discussion at the April meeting, and then an agreed submission to ministers. I don't think we have available to pour over with you all the documentation between now and the next meeting, but do you have any general recollection of the extent to which members were able to provide you with any further information to flesh out those gaps?
I had a feeling I got nothing, actually, apart from obviously discussing with Ari Zuckerman. I think the data just wasn't there. And if there had been, it would have been incorporated in subsequent papers, and I don't see that being incorporated.
Yes, I think just for the sake of completeness, if we go to the next meeting, NHBT 5072_098. 5 zeros, yes. 72_098. So this is the 24th of April 1990 meeting. If we go to page 4, bottom of the page, paragraph 29 is the Chair's summing up of the discussion, which we've looked at on previous occasions. But if we go to the top of the next page, paragraph 30, which is the second paragraph on the page, the Chairman remarked that the paper by the Economic Advisers Office, ACVSB 6 of 6, and I think we haven't got that, I think, in the papers, but the inquiry can no doubt look at it separately, reflected the lack of data.
Yes.
So it doesn't sound as though you were much further on in that calculation.
Well, yeah, but this time it was the economic advisers who had done the paper.
Now, can I then just pick up with you the submission that then went to, or the note that went to ministers? As we've seen there in paragraph 31, it says a note would be prepared for ministers telling them the outcome of the discussion. And we've got that at NHBT 5061_130. At 1st of May 1990, from Mr. Canavan to Dr. Metters and to the private office of the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the Lords. And we can see that you were copied in. Minister may recall that the question whether to screen all blood donations for hepatitis C virus has been under discussion in the ACVSB. This notice to advise Minister of Developments. And then we can see reference there to developments in other countries. In France, Belgium, Luxembourg and Finland, screening has recently been introduced for all donations. And in Italy, the screening is voluntary. However, at its meeting on the 24th of April, our committee reaffirmed its view that the introduction of routine screening would not yet be justified. And then there's reference to awaiting FDA approval, still unresolved difficulties concerning the tests, and reference to a pilot study. What is your recollection, if any, of the weight that was attached either by the committee or by officials within the department to the fact that other countries were not seemingly finding this such a difficult decision-making process, and other countries, obviously not all, some other countries had gone ahead with hepatitis C screening?
I can't be sure what my views were at the time, to be honest. The fact it was being reported, that was part of the background. I wasn't aware at any time did we get what I would regard as an evaluation of how it had worked out in these countries. Okay, some of the screening positivity type data we had, but nothing about how they coped with the false positives. And I mean, how useful it would have been to know how they'd managed these countries was not entirely clear because the strains were different as we were discovering. And I think those who were closer to the action in terms of either virology or the transfusion service, they had their own contacts and were aware of what was going on, I hope. But I don't think they've ever fed back to us about any important tips to how to do it from some of these other countries. And that would have been really quite helpful, because we assumed they were grappling the same issues as we were, but we didn't get any feedback as to how they'd overcome them, if indeed they had done. And I don't know if you're going to ask me later about why countries are different, but I think there may be important lessons in there.
In terms of the position in relation to other countries, what you've just said appears to reflect certainly the minutes, and I think the other documentation that I've seen, that it's recorded as a fact.
Yes.
But the minutes don't seem to just exhibit an enormous amount of discussion about that, and you can't record.
No, I can't recall that, but I suspect if there had been real information on the evaluation of how the introduction had gone in Finland, say, we'd have leapt on it. I mean, no question, if there had been any mention of that, it would have been recorded. And I think that is probably one of the things that was missing. So we believe these other countries were doing it. The only feedback we got was sometimes on the positivity rate in terms of some tests. And also, I think we had some information how they were handling, or just deferring donors, basically, not even telling them they were positive sometimes.
Did the department, as far as you're aware, rather than perhaps passively wait and see if information came to it about other countries, proactively go out and try and find out what the experiences were and how other countries were dealing with these issues?
I don't remember us doing that, but I think there was attendance at international conferences by quite a few members of this committee, so in effect we were doing it through them. I don't know if Dr. Raymond at this time was sent overseas to one of these conferences. I suspect not, but I think we were relying on the committee members to bring that as part of their expert knowledge back to the committee.
And then if we go to NHBT 5061_133, this is a communication from the British Embassy in the States to the Procurement Directorate, 3rd of May 1990, reporting that the Abbott test kit had been licensed by the FDA with no restrictions, but that Chiron ortho kits had not yet been licensed. And it's really just the handwritten bit I wanted to ask you about. This is, as I understand it, Mr. Canavan to you. I think that's right anyway. Dr. Pickles, it's still not clear if the FDA has recommended routine...
Yeah, we don't need to panic.
Just allow Council to finish the question, won't you?
It's still not clear if the FDA has recommended routine screening with the Abbott kit. Presumably the blood banks will take their own decisions. Since ortho are still out in the cold, our pilot study approach still seems defensible and we don't need to panic. Do you take this view?
Do you share this view?
Sorry, do you share this view? This is a communication to you, not your own words, but do you have any recollection or any insight into why it's phrased in this in these terms? Why is the position's defensible? We don't need to panic.
I don't know. I presume Mr. Canavan may have been worried of seemed to be too far behind the States. That's just supposition now. I'm sorry, I don't know what I recorded saying at the time.
If we move to July 1990, I don't need to take you to the minutes. For the transcript, it's PRSE 0000976. That's the in-principle decision by the ACVSB to recommend hepatitis C screening, but then to say, but there'll be a pilot study to work out which of two tests is the better one. What I wanted to do then is pick things up with a handful of documents. So we don't need that one, Lawrence. Is pick things up with a handful of documents that post-date that decision. So if we go to NHBT 000061_164, This is Dr. Metters to Mr. Malone Lee, who I think was the NHS Management Executive.
Exactly.
It's in response to a minute, which I'll just again read the transcript for the record, but we don't need to put it up on screen. NHBT 5061_154 was Mr. Malone Lee's minute of the 9th of July referred to here. And then we can see the estimate of full year costs said to be 5.6 million, I think is what's said in that first paragraph. And then Dr. Metters says this, well, I agree the submission informing ministers of the advice recently given by ACVSB must deal with the resource consequences for hepatitis C screening. The fact is we did have prior warning of the likely cost. And then this, Dr. Pickles, and this is what I want to ask you about. You will also be aware of the questioning ministers have received about why this country has not yet moved on this form of screening when other countries have introduced it for the protection of recipients of donated blood. Now, that appears to be Dr. Metters articulating square on that issue about other countries are doing it, why aren't we? It doesn't, unfortunately, tell us what the answer to that might be or what the questioning had been of ministers. Do you have any further recollection?
I don't know, but I would suggest you look at the parliamentary record to see what the questions were at the time.
And then I think we can probably, we don't need to look at all the additional documents. It's then November 1990, so I think around 4.5 months after the decision in principle, sorry, the recommendation in principle was made by the ACVSB, that the ACVSB then says we recommend screening be introduced as soon as practicable, and RTCs can decide which of the two tests they use. Again, for the transcript, no need to put this up, Lawrence. It's PRSC 302425. What I want then to do is pick up a minute of yours, Dr. Pickles, after that decision. So it's DHSC 0002498_078. So this is you, 7th of December, to Mr. Canavan, and it refers, we can see again, the context is the ministerial submission is being drafted to go to ministers for a decision as to whether they accept the recommendation. You've obviously had a discussion with Dr. Metters, who hadn't yet had a chance to read the draft submission itself. And then you say this, that's Dr. Metters, suggests it should go around now for consultation in the usual way to NHSME, so that's the NHS Management Executive colleagues, also CMO's office, Mr. Heppel. Territorials also have to be kept in touch. The covering note should state that the submission conveys the clear advice of the ACVSB, a committee set up specifically to advise on this type of issue. Their firm advice is based on the public health risk if the introduction of HCV screening is delayed. Their decision for screening was taken in July and delayed until now so that the details could be sorted out. Whilst we are consulting widely before going forward, we are anxious to avoid further delays. So that's your take, as I understand it, on, or yours and Dr. Metters' perhaps combined take upon the position that this is now something that the ACVSB are very firmly behind and a decision must be taken as soon as possible. And
Dr. Metters is trying very hard to push for the advice of his committee. And you see the annotation at the bottom is that he then read the submission and wants it to be beefed up, please.
Yeah. And I think we have then a further comment from Dr. Metters at NHBT 0000061_201. This is Dr. Metters to Mr. Canavan on the 18th of December 1990, and it looks like there might be a further iteration of the draft submission, which is referred to in paragraph 1. And it may indeed have been the same version, but Dr. Metters' concern is the same. My major concern is that the submission does not properly reflect the views of ACVSB. The committee in July reached the conclusion that HCV screening could prevent a significant proportion of post-transfusion hepatitis, and then there's reference to Professor Zuckerman, and then 3, Furthermore, the committee's view is that with the existence of the current test procedures, to continue a policy of not screening poses an unacceptable risk to the health of recipients of blood and plasma. The committee recognised that detailed cost benefits of HCV screening could not be quantified. Nevertheless, their unanimous conclusion is that the UK should follow the lead of an increasingly long list of countries who have now introduced HCV screening in order to significantly reduce the load of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis. The submission must convey more clearly CVSB's position and the committee's assessment of the benefit/risk balance. Now, is it right to understand from this that on the economic cost-benefit analysis, that there may have been some further data, but that there still wasn't really by any means any kind of complete picture. But now it's that perhaps sort of pure public health imperative of we can prevent transmission and it's unacceptable not to do so.
Yeah, and I mean, this is an unusually forceful minute, I think, from a DCMO. I wouldn't be sure there was another version of the submission. This might have been his reflection, having read that earlier version. He's laying it on pretty thick, and basically he's doing what he thinks is right for the public health and acting as a committee chairman. So, and good for him.
By this point, at least, he's not suggesting that there's any good reason for the UK not to be doing what other countries are doing. So whatever the position might have been earlier, he's saying that, you know, we have to now follow the lead of those countries.
Yeah, well, it's not following the lead of other countries. It was the advice of the committee, having looked to see how the science had changed and how, you know, the various pilot tests had come through. That was why they were able to make a decision at the November meeting. He's saying, you know, get on with it, basically.
Now, in relation to that point in paragraph 2 about Professor Zuckerman and the 30%,
yes,
you responded to Dr. Metters on the 21st of December on that specific point, NHBT 000061_206. And you say in your first paragraph on the 21st of December minute, purpose is to explain why that point's not been incorporated into the submission. The next paragraph, you say you're not clear, I'm paraphrasing, the precise basis for it.
Yes.
But then the third paragraph, you say this, the main reason for not mentioning this figure is we suspect those who did the economic appraisal would be surprised that a figure as low as 30% was quoted. We do not want to give them more ammunition. Yeah. What was the concern in that last sentence?
To be honest, if the main infection in transfusion recipients was non-A, non-B, which is what was the accepted view, and only 30% of it could be affected, that leaves 70% unaffected by this proposal. And I think people might say that feels like a very poor value for money. So it seemed unnecessary to include that in the submission, particularly as we're not sure of what the population was and the tests that led to that figure.
So was there a concern that, whether it's the Economic Advisor's Office or the NHS Management Executive, but those for whom the finances were the imperative or an important consideration, that they might voice opposition to the recommendation?
I don't define who them is, but I thought it was wise not to include that.
Now, just really so that we see the paperwork, not because I need to ask you the detail of it, but the submission went to the Minister on the 21st of December, so in fact the same date as that minute. It's PRSE 304667. And if we go to page 5, we'll see the first of 2 annexes. This is headed hepatitis C virus and blood transfusion. And then if we go to page 8, Annex B is a further version of the economic appraisal. And we can just pick it up in the first paragraph. It says, with the assistance of the Economic Advisor's Office, we've attempted an economic appraisal of routine testing of blood donations for HCV antibodies, but were greatly handicapped by incomplete information on the current burden of transfusion-associated non-A, non-B and its costs. This summarises the analysis, updates it with the results from the pilot survey, points out the main areas where information is deficient. The main conclusion is that the benefits for the estimated £5 to £6 million first year cost is uncertain, but could be in the order of £6,000 per QALY for the lives saved. And then there is a description of costs and benefits, which in terms of the benefits, if we go to the next page, is, and this is not a criticism, Dr. Pickles, it's light on figures.
Quite.
It's a narrative account now of what the benefits might be.
Absolutely, and that's all we could do. And if you, I think in some of the correspondence that led up to this, the economic advisors said they weren't prepared to put their name to this this annex. So this is the best we could do, and I'm afraid a narrative account. It's pretty inadequate, frankly, as a expenditure analysis.
Annexes A and B to the submission, I think, were your work.
There's a C as well. There's a third annex.
Oh, is there?
I can't remember what it's in, but some versions of this document have got Annex C. I think it weighs
Yes,
the
you're
cost.
absolutely right. I'm so sorry. The final page, which was options for reducing costs, considerations be given to whether costs can be reduced in the following ways, and that is Annex C. And those were your work, the Annex.
I think Annex C might have been Mr. Canavan, but I think A and B were done probably jointly with Dr. Raymond, but I would claim main authorship of that version.
Now, ministerial approval was duly forthcoming on the 16th of January 91. We don't need to put the document up on screen, Lawrence. For the transcript, the reference is NHBT 40191_013. What I want then to do is just look at a document from you that postdates the ministerial approval. So it's WITN 4486062. Just before we look at the content of this, in terms of the chronology, obviously we're now in February 1991. The recommendation in principle had been made in July of the previous year. The recommendation to go ahead as soon as practicable, November. We've got Dr. Metters saying, the committee's position was that this was an unacceptable risk. The ministers said, OK. We're now 5th of February. Yeah. And what we get is Dr. Gunson's been in touch with all the RTCs. There are all sorts of problems still. There remains real concern about how the necessary money will get into the system. The starting date he wanted to try out on me was 1st of July. Would this be too late? My initial reaction was this would be okay. Attempting to go earlier would mean some stragglers would be left behind. The slight delay increased the chance of the finance being sorted out and the diversion of RTC resources to Gulf-related activities. A short time date might not be feasible. Now, that sense of urgency, which seemed to have been injected into the process in November, December 1990, then that doesn't really come across here, Dr. Pickles. Would you accept that?
I'd accept that, and that actually was the message that Dr. Gunson had got back from the transfusion service, that they needed a longer lead time than perhaps we had estimated. Needed 6 months to get things in order, and so it was very, very frustrating. But they were the ones who had to do it. And as I point out here, requiring them to go earlier or forcing them to go earlier would mean, or not having a uniform date would mean some people would, be left behind. And although there's a lot of emphasis on potentially delaying those who would go early, I think we should also remember, actually, if we didn't have a uniform date and we didn't listen to their problems, we could have had even greater list of stragglers, those coming much later than the majority of colleagues. So, the annotation at the bottom says a uniform starting date. On that basis, I'm afraid, yes, it does feel as if the urgency is gone, but I assure you, I think Dr. Metters would agree with me that yeah, we were still very keen to go as soon as it was possible for the service to introduce it.
I'll pick up the point about stragglers in a few minutes where we look at the converse position and what happened in relation to Newcastle. The other two observations you make, one is increase the chance of the finance being sorted out, and we saw in the first paragraph Dr Gunson saying concern about how the necessary money will get into the system. The department had taken a position, by this stage, it may well have been its position throughout, that it wasn't going to provide any additional finance, is that right?
Well, the additional finance would come from the standard NHS allocation.
There was going to be no extra money made available to the regions for it?
No extra money from what? I mean, actually, it all comes from the same... Money for the NHS comes from the NHS vote, so just redistributing the NHS vote and taking a top slice to give them some, that decision, that wasn't to be done.
And then in relation to the Gulf-related activities, but presumably a reference there to the Gulf War, do you recall now the extent to which that was a significant difficulty?
I think in my statement I say I wasn't sure how evidence-based that was, and it was only later, during the Penrose inquiry, one of the documents I received, which I must admit I didn't even read when I did my Penrose response, was a very strong statement from Dr Cash about how the Gulf War, he couldn't possibly do it because of the Gulf War.
So I know at the time, I've only got about another 15 minutes of questions, all of which, with a couple of exceptions, are on this topic. So up to you and Dr Pickles as to whether we carry on and then take the break for CP questions, which
Well,
avoid
I
another
think
break.
there are then two parties to consider. One is yourself, Dr Pickles, but the second is the transcriber,
Yes.
and perhaps as she is listening to this, she can indicate whether she is happy to go on for another quarter of an hour or whether she would like her break now. There are plain health and safety considerations for typing for too long.
Transcriber's happy to
I've had the information that she's happy to go on for a quarter of an hour. Are you content?
Yes, I'm happy.
Then that's what we'll do. So let's continue.
Now, the next meeting of the ACVSB, which you flag up as happening shortly in the last paragraph of this note, then, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially delayed the start date arguably still further by saying, oh, well, let's have the testing of second generation. Well, the second generation tests are going to be available, but there'll need to be a study in relation to those. Do you remember what the department's response or your own response was in relation to that, whether that was really necessary?
I think I've seen in the documentation somewhere that the second generation tests didn't have an FDA license, and therefore we had to have a study in our domestic circumstances in any case to validate them. So I think that would have carried some weight. And the first generation tests, the ones that we'd done the pilots with, were being withdrawn, so we essentially didn't have much of a choice. But that's testing detail I was not perhaps that familiar with.
We now get to, well, as you know, the date then shifted further from April to July, as we see here, and then from July till September. We then have the issue in relation to Newcastle, and if I can just ask you to look at a couple of documents in relation to that briefly. NHBT 000062_053. This was Dr. Raymond on the 30th of April 91, updating the relevant minister with this. PSL will wish to be aware the Northern Regional Transfusion Centre based at Newcastle has unilaterally started anti-HCV screening, despite agreement that screening would start simultaneously throughout the UK. And there's a reference to that being pursued with the Regional General Manager to obtain more information. What was, to your recollection, your response or the department's response in relation to Dr. Lloyd's decision, given, has indeed told this inquiry, but said at the time he was ready and didn't want to be in the position of not using tests which could prevent the transmission of hepatitis when he was ready to go ahead.
I have difficulty remembering what I thought at the time, but I'm assuming that I shared, I was obviously aware of Dr. Gunson's great concern that, and indeed shared by some of the other fellow transfusion directors, that somebody had broken ranks and ignored an agreement that he'd made with his colleagues. So I was, throughout I was close to Dr. Gunson, and I would have shared his anguish, really. That's my assumption now. I don't know quite what I wrote at the time.
Looking back now, how would you weigh the concept of breaking ranks against the possibility of saving lives?
Well, it was interesting because the way it was ended up being presented was that he was doing an evaluation that was needed in any case, the second generation tests. So there are ways in which, if he was really that ready, he could have been part of a pilot study. So there was a potential for a compromise. It would have been much easier both in presentation terms, but also enabled us to get proper data back from him as to how things were working. And I think, later in one of the minutes it suggests there is data from the other centres that were doing pilot studies, but none yet from Newcastle. So actually breaking ranks meant that we didn't have the benefit. If he was really that keen to go, he could have been part of the pilot, and it was a shame that we didn't have that opportunity, because the rest of us could have learned from him. So I'm sorry, and part of the purpose of having a pilot, you're not quite sure how things are going to work out. I mean, it worked out all right in the end, but it might not have done, and we have to keep on remembering that. No, I appreciate from the view of people who are infected that it looks as if we're holding back an advance, but I would back up Dr. Gunson on this, and indeed the rest of the transfusion directors.
Yes, perhaps right to point out that a number who expressed views at the time in quite vehement terms to Dr. Lloyd, having their evidence to this inquiry, expressed
I have seen that
significant degree of
as
regret
well,
about that.
And I'm not close enough to this and those to be able to know, actually.
Can I then just ask you to look at one last document on this issue, which is NHBT 0000192_033. And this picks up on a point you made a few moments ago, Dr. Pickles. This is from you too, Dr. Metters, 10th of May. You say you'll be aware of problems raised by the premature HCV testing being introduced in Northern Region. Following discussion with Dr. Gunson in your absence, I agreed that it would be sensible to present the testing as part of the multi-centre trial of second-generation tests. And then it said that Dr. Lloyd was happy to pass on his results in that way.
Yes, we talk about the first ones not being available, and these are not FDA approved.
Yes, that's that paragraph 4. The suggestion that what was being done in Newcastle was part of the trial was, it might be said, really a face-saving exercise, was it not, for the department or the blood transfusion service? It didn't really reflect the actual truth of the position.
I don't know, but this was, I don't know if it was Dr. Gunson's suggestion or mine, but the fact that we would get the results, pass the results on, I'm not sure we did do that. But, I keep on coming back to the fact this is a trial with a new test that was not FDA approved, and we couldn't anticipate what the results of the trial would be. And looking back with retrospect, we had acceptable results in the trial. It might not have turned out that way. Sorry, what was the question?
No. I'm not sure what the question was, but I think you might have... Well, I said it didn't reflect the actual truth of the position, and you've indicated that you've made reference to what Dr. Gunson, I think, may have... I don't know whether it was Dr. Gunson's suggestion or mine.
Can we have both of you speaking at one time, please?
I agree it's a presentational issue.
Can I ask you about what you said in paragraph 5, second sentence? Since the scientific case for testing is rather less clear-cut than when the decision to go for testing was made, this delay is quite excusable. We understand that Germany, for example, will be taking a year to introduce testing there. What did you mean by scientific case for testing rather less clear-cut?
I think we're getting probably greater information about discordant results from different tests, and there were, tests that were available weren't from different companies were giving different results, and repeat tests were giving different results. And I'm assuming that's what, one of the reasons why people were not pressing too hard on the science is because the case was not cut and dried. And as for Germany, for example, that was, at one stage, a year earlier, we'd said that Germany was going to introduce testing. And here, for example, they're going to take a year to introduce testing. We didn't really get feedback from Germany. It was a time of reunification, so I don't know if that was both sides of Germany that were doing that. So some of the information on which we had a year earlier was obviously not seen to be correct at that time.
If we just leave aside the question of the second generation tests not having FDA approval, what else had changed in terms of the science since the clear decision of the CVSB in November and that very firm minute from Dr. Metters saying, the committee has judged it's an unacceptable risk not to introduce screening? I'm sorry, it may be there in the paper somewhere, but can I suggest you're seeing Professor Tedder at some stage, and I'm sure he'll be able to answer that one. Can I just then, really, without looking at any of the further documents, I hope we've looked at enough to give a prompt as to the decision-making process coupled with, obviously, your own narrative and your statement. Just want to explore a couple of further themes with you. So it could be said, might be said, that there was an insufficient sense of the urgency, an insufficient sense of the importance of this issue, and a sense of complacency in the overall decision-making process regarding the introduction of hepatitis C screening and the fact that it wasn't introduced, with the exception of Newcastle, till September 91. What, if any, response would you make to that?
Well, I absolutely refute any suggestion of complacency. I think the evidence that I've seen and been reminded of the paperwork reinforces my memory that people were concerned and keen to push on as fast as was feasible, and frustrated that really the service needed longer to be ready to introduce this. And also conscious that if they were asked to do it before they were ready, that risked undermining existing procedures for current screening of what was then current screening of infections. So there were risks associated with forcing the service to go earlier than they were ready.
And then the second general question, why was the position of the FDA or the waiting for licensing by the FDA apparently so persuasive in the department's thinking? Because other countries clearly were introducing and using the kits without waiting for the United States regulatory body to take the...
Yeah, I may have to sort of check on the timing, but rereading the documents, it seems to be three sorts of FDA approval. One, I mean, they approved tests in a way we didn't at that time. One was the export license. So some of the trials were held up because there wasn't an export license from the States of this prototype tests, so there weren't enough to get hold of to be able to even do an evaluation here.
And just pausing there, I think that was resolved in June of 1990, as I recall from
so, but they presume the second generation test may be subject to export licenses in the same way.
Because actually, 1989, the export license was granted.
I absolutely stand corrected by you, sir, because I haven't got my notes with me.
27th of November 1989, the reference is NHBT 40188_123.
Okay, so the export license is needed to be able to do initial studies. There's the licensing of the tests as appropriate for use in blood banks, which, if they had failed to license it, suggest there may have been a problem with the tests that we perhaps didn't appreciate. And then there was a recommendation from the FDA that it should be used as a routine in blood banks. So FDA approval comes in three ways, I think, and I'm sort of doing this now from the documents. And I'm not sure we would have waited or been that concerned about FDA approval for use in blood banks, their blood banks, because the prevalence of infection was so very different, and their blood donors were so different from ours. The validity of the test, which is essentially the main FDA approval, would be a matter of concern. By the time of the second generation tests, I don't know what feedback we had about whether they were about to be approved. But to use them in advance of that validation would have been risky. So that's what I'm assuming now, but I was not the expert in this field.
I appreciate that, and it may be you can't answer my final question on that topic, but let me just ask it anyway. In terms of the FDA approval of the test kits, or the licensing of the test kits, the documentation doesn't, I think, suggest that was somehow mandatory for them to be used. It was the preference or thought appropriate, I think is the term used at one stage, that they should be licensed by the FDA before being used in this country. Is that right?
There was no formal requirement that there had to be FDA approval of the tests, or that they had to be approved for their use in the United States.
There's then, I'm sorry, I've gone slightly over 15 minutes, but there's then, on a completely separate topic, just two very short documents and two very short questions arising out of them. If we go to DHSC 0002472_135, this is a March 1991 minute from you to Mr. Harvey in MCA, so Medicines Control Agency. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you talk in paragraph 1 about BPL supplying the market, commercial companies being squeezed, fierce battle taking place, some companies are resorting to sharp practices. And this is in the context of supply of factor 8. What were the sharp practices that you were worried about? Do you recall? I think so you talk about. So sorry, I should have directed your attention to the second paragraph first. So promotion direct to the public, and then you refer to ARMA sponsoring haemophilia society.
Can you just go to the bottom of this one? Is this? Yes, this had been raised with the Minister by the chairman of the CBLA, and I don't know what that might be, but it's a sharp practice to promote prescription-only medicine directly to the public. It's actually illegal, but maybe that's what I'm implying at. And at the same time, by implying that something is more safe than an alternative product, is also outside the regulatory constraints under the Licence Act. So I suspect those are the two main ones.
And is it right to understand then that's the basis for your concern in paragraph 4 about the ARMA sponsoring the Haemophilia Society's bulletin?
Yeah.
And then the final document is DHSC 0024528. This is a separate topic, February 1990. This is you to Dr. Wood. And if we can go to the third paragraph. So this is in the context, again, of BPL being able to supply more product. In the third paragraph, you say this. You refer to there being an attempt to base product identities on safety profiles, that's the 5th line, and then this. There's a danger if this gets out of hand and leads to knocking copy, there could be a loss in patient confidence, which, for example, may reflect badly on the HIV litigation now before the courts. What did you mean by reflecting badly on the HIV litigation, please?
I don't know, I'm assuming I'm talking about the knocking copy media interest, picking up that some products are supposedly safer than BPL products. No evidence base for that, and would make, well, loss in patient confidence. Not very helpful to have that being danger of these products at that time being debated freely. I'm assuming that's what it was. That's what it says, actually.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask. I should say I'm not proposing to ask Dr. Pickles about VCJD, notwithstanding her very substantial work in relation to the BSc inquiry, not least because Dr. Pickles left the department before the acute decisions about transmissibility of VCJD through blood and blood products had to be taken. But there are some matters that Dr. Pickles has dealt with in her statement where she's given a very full answer to the inquiry's questions, and that's why I'm not proposing to pick it up orally. But if we could take a break, both for Dr. Pickles' sake, for transcribers, but also so that call participants can suggest any further questions they wish me to consider asking.
Yes, you'll know, I think, from watching or listening to the inquiry previously, that at this stage, the core participants are entitled to put questions through counsel to you, rising out of your evidence, whether your written evidence or your oral evidence. And they will have that chance. How long do you suggest? Half an hour?
Half an hour should suffice, yes.
Very well. Well, let's say, would 4:05 be appropriate?
Thank you, sir.
Not before 4:05. If you need more time, you'll let us know. Not before 4:05.